The morning sun stretched its golden fingers across Bitter Creek Valley, a place where the rolling plains met the foothills of the Wind River Range in Wyoming. On the western edge stood the reservation of the Eastern Shoshone tribe, while the eastern side was dominated by cattle ranches that had been passed down through generations of settler families. Between them ran Bitter Creek itself, a natural boundary that had, for decades, also served as an unspoken cultural divide. Jack Thornton wiped sweat from his brow as he urged his horse along the fence line of the Double T Ranch. At 45, his face was weathered from years under the harsh Wyoming sun, deep lines etching the corners of his eyes. His ranch bordered the reservation lands, and though relations had improved in recent years, there remained an undercurrent of tension. History doesn't wash away as easily as footprints in creek water. "Looks like we've got a break in the northeast section," Jack called to his 19-year-old son, Dylan, who rode alongside him. "We'll need to fix it before nightfall. Can't afford to lose any more cattle this season." Dylan nodded, his youthful face serious beneath his worn Stetson. "I'll grab the tools from the truck." As they worked to repair the fence, Jack noticed a plume of dust rising from a dirt road that cut through reservation land. A beat-up blue pickup truck approached, coming to a stop nearby. From it emerged Nina Two Rivers, a young Shoshone woman in her early 30s, who worked as a nurse at the reservation clinic. "Mr. Thornton," she called, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "Can I have a word?" Jack straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. He and Nina weren't strangers. She had helped treat him 2 winters ago when he'd broken his leg in a riding accident. The reservation clinic had been closer than the hospital in town. "What can I do for you, Nina?" he asked, tipping his hat. "There's a tribal council meeting tonight," she said, her dark eyes serious. "Elder Joseph is proposing a formal claim to extend water rights from Bitter Creek. With the drought getting worse, the council feels it's time to enforce the original treaty boundaries." Jack felt a familiar tension settle in his shoulders. Water rights were everything in this part of Wyoming. The Double T had relied on Bitter Creek for 3 generations, but he knew the history, knew that the original treaties had indeed granted those rights to the Shoshone. "That creek waters my entire south pasture," Jack said, trying to keep his voice level. "Has for 60 years. And it watered our people's crops for centuries before that," Nina replied, not unkindly, but firmly. "I'm not here to argue, Mr. Thornton. I just thought you should know before you hear it from someone else. Elder Joseph respects you, which is why he asked me to come." Dylan had moved closer, his stance defensive. "Dad's already struggling to keep this place going since Mom died. You people know that." "Dylan," Jack warned, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Nina's expression softened slightly. "I understand this is difficult. That's why I'm inviting you to the meeting. Come, speak your piece. This affects both our communities." After Nina left, Dylan kicked at a fence post. "They're trying to run us off our land, just like they did to the Hansons last year." "That was different," Jack said quietly. "The Hansons sold out to that resort developer. Nobody forced them." "Still," Dylan muttered, "why should we give up anything more? Wasn't taking most of the land enough?" Jack watched his son, seeing not just anger but fear in his eyes. The ranch was all they had left of Elizabeth, Jack's late wife. 3 years since cancer took her, and the wound still felt fresh. "I'll go to the meeting," Jack decided. "These things get worse when people don't talk." That evening, as Jack drove toward the reservation community center, he noticed dark clouds gathering over the mountains. The weather report had mentioned possible thunderstorms, rare for this time of year, but not unheard of, as if the land itself was unsettled by the brewing conflict. What he couldn't know was that the coming storm would change everything, not just for him and Dylan, but for the entire valley, and that before the week was out. Ancient traditions and modern lives would collide in ways no one could have predicted. The tribal council meeting had gone exactly as Jack had expected. Tense exchanges, historical grievances aired, and practical concerns raised on both sides. Elder Joseph Skye, at 82, commanded respect from everyone in the room. His deeply lined face told the story of a man who had seen his people through decades of struggle. When he spoke of the original boundaries outlined in the Fort Bridger Treaty of 1868, Even Jack had to admit the old man had history on his side. "We do not wish to deprive your cattle of water, Mr. Thornton," Elder Joseph had said, his voice soft, yet carrying weight. "But the drought grows worse each year. Our community garden project feeds many families. Without expanded irrigation from the creek, it cannot survive." By the meeting's end, a tentative agreement had been reached. A joint water management committee would be formed with representatives from both the ranch and tribal communities. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As Jack drove home through the darkness, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain hammered against his truck's windshield, and lightning slashed across the sky in brilliant forks. The radio crackled with an emergency weather alert, flash flood warnings for Bitter Creek and surrounding areas. "Damn it," Jack muttered, pressing his foot harder on the accelerator. Dylan was alone at the ranch, and the south pasture where they'd moved the pregnant heifers was low-lying, dangerously close to the creek. The truck's headlights cut through sheets of rain as Jack navigated the muddy road. When he crested the hill overlooking Bitter Creek, his heart sank. Even through the downpour, he could see the creek had already burst its banks, water rushing across the fields like a hungry beast. Reaching the ranch house, Jack found Dylan already dressed in rain gear, loading rope into the bed of his pickup. "The heifers are still down there, Dad." Dylan shouted over the storm. "I was about to head out." "We'll go together," Jack replied, grabbing his own raincoat. "It's too dangerous alone." Father and son drove as close as they could to the south pasture, but soon the road disappeared beneath swirling brown water. They abandoned the truck and proceeded on foot, fighting against the current that already reached their knees. Using powerful flashlights, they located the small herd of heifers huddled on a shrinking island of higher ground. The animals were panicked, eyes rolling white in the beam of the flashlights. "We need to guide them to the north slope," Jack shouted, pointing to the ascending ground that led away from the flooded creek. Working in sync, they began herding the frightened cattle through the rising water. As they struggled with the last few animals, Jack's flashlight caught something unexpected. A vehicle on the reservation side of the creek, partially submerged and tilted at a dangerous angle. It was Nina's blue pickup. "Someone's over there," Dylan called, having spotted it too. Without hesitation, Jack handed the rope to his son. "Get these last heifers to safety. I'm going to check." "Dad, no. The current's too strong." But Jack was already moving, leaning into the force of the water as he made his way toward the stranded vehicle. The creek, normally just 15 feet across, had become a churning river nearly 50 feet wide. When Jack reached the truck, he found Nina inside, conscious but trapped. The truck had slid off the road and rolled onto its side, pinning her leg beneath the crushed dashboard. "I was bringing medicine to Elder Joseph's granddaughter," Nina explained through gritted teeth. "The baby has a fever. I thought I could beat the storm." Jack tried the door, but it was jammed shut by the weight of the vehicle. Water was steadily rising inside the cab. "Hold on," he told her, searching for something to use as a lever. Finding a sturdy branch that had washed downstream, he managed to create enough space for Nina to wiggle free. As she emerged, she clutched a small backpack containing medical supplies. "Can you walk?" Jack asked, supporting her as she tested her injured leg. "I have to," she replied grimly. "The baby needs these antibiotics." Together, they began the treacherous journey back across the swollen creek. The water had risen further, now reaching Jack's chest in some places. He kept one arm around Nina's waist, helping her stay upright against the current. They were halfway across when Jack heard it, a deep, ominous roar that rose above even the sound of the storm. Upstream, a wall of water and debris was hurtling toward them, the result of a flash flood from the mountains. "Run!" Jack shouted, pushing Nina toward the ranch side of the creek where Dylan waited, horror-struck at the sight of the approaching deluge. In that moment, Jack Thornton made a choice that would echo through Bitter Creek Valley for generations to come. 3 days after the flood, the skies above Bitter Creek Valley had cleared to a painful blue, as if nature herself were pretending innocence. The waters had receded, leaving behind a scarred landscape, fields strewn with debris, fences destroyed, and the creek itself carved into a new, wider channel. Nina Two Rivers sat on the porch of her small reservation home, her splinted leg propped on a chair. The baby she had been rushing to help, little Sarah Sky, Elder Joseph's great-granddaughter, slept peacefully in a cradleboard beside her, the fever broken thanks to the antibiotics that had somehow remained dry in their waterproof case. The cost of that medicine's delivery weighed heavily on Nina's heart. Jack Thornton had pushed her toward safety just before the wall of water hit. Dylan had managed to pull her the rest of the way to higher ground, but Jack had been swept away by the furious current. His body was found the next morning, 2 miles downstream, tangled in the branches of a fallen cottonwood tree. A knock at the door pulled Nina from her thoughts. It was Dylan Thornton, his young face haggard with grief, eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "How's your leg?" he asked, his voice rough from crying. "It's healing," Nina replied softly. "Dylan, I'm so sorry about your father. If I hadn't been out there—" "Don't," Dylan cut her off, raising a hand. "Dad made his choice. He was always like that. Mom used to say he'd walk through fire for a stranger." His voice broke on the last word. After a moment of silence, Dylan continued, "I came because there's something you should know. The funeral is day after tomorrow, and I need your help with something." Inside, he explained that while going through his father's desk, he'd found a letter written shortly after his mother's death. In it, Jack had expressed a wish that seemed impossible to fulfill. He wrote that he'd come to respect the Shoshone ways, Dylan said, unfolding the worn paper, that he'd learned more about your people's connection to this land during his recovery at the clinic. He wrote that when his time came, he hoped to be buried in a way that would honor both the land and its first people. Nina studied the young man before her. "You want to give your father a traditional Shoshone burial ceremony? Is that even possible for an outsider?" Dylan asked, uncertainty clear in his voice. "It's unprecedented," Nina admitted. "I would need to speak with Elder Joseph and the council." That evening, Nina presented Dylan's request to the tribal council. The meeting room in the community center fell silent as Elder Joseph considered the matter, his ancient fingers tracing patterns on the table before him. "Jack Thornton died saving one of our own," the old man finally said, "and in doing so, ensured the survival of my great-granddaughter. The old ways teach us that a life debt must be honored." A heated discussion followed. Some council members argued that sacred traditions should remain within the tribe. Others pointed out that Jack had shown respect for their ways in life and had paid the ultimate price while helping their community. "There is precedent in our oldest stories," Elder Joseph eventually said, silencing the debate, "of outsiders who proved themselves true friends to the people and were honored accordingly. I believe Jack Thornton has earned such recognition." The following day, Nina brought the news to Dylan. "The council has agreed. Your father will be given a modified burial ceremony that honors both his own traditions and ours. But there's something you need to understand first." She explained that in the traditional Shoshone burial, sacred objects would be included with the body, items that would help the spirit on its journey to the afterlife. Among these would be small bone carvings that had been in Elder Joseph's family for generations. "These aren't just symbols," Nina emphasized. "To our people, they contain spiritual power. By including them in your father's burial, the council is saying that his spirit is welcome among our ancestors." Dylan's eyes widened as he grasped the significance. "Will people be angry about these sacred things going to a white man?" "Some might be," Nina acknowledged. "But Elder Joseph believes this is the right path. The flood changed more than just the creek's course, Dylan. It's given us a chance to heal old wounds." On the day of the burial, ranchers and tribal members gathered together on a hillside overlooking both the ranch and reservation lands. Jack's body, wrapped in a special blanket woven with both traditional Shoshone patterns and the Thornton Ranch brand, was laid to rest in a grave that faced the sunrise. Elder Joseph performed the ceremony, speaking first in Shoshone and then in English, his weathered voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "Today, we do not bury a cowboy or a rancher," he intoned. "We return a brother to the earth that sustains us all." Summer gave way to autumn, painting the Bitter Creek Valley in burnished gold and fiery red. 3 months had passed since Jack Thornton's burial, and the landscape bore the scars of change. The creek itself had carved a new path, slicing through what had once been boundary lines as if nature itself had decided to redraw the map. Dylan Thornton stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the land that was now solely his responsibility. At 19, he found himself the owner of the Double T, with all its debts, demands, and history. The weight of it pressed down on him like the heavy winter snows that would soon blanket the valley. "Your coffee's getting cold," came a voice from behind him. Nina Two Rivers had taken to stopping by the ranch twice a week, initially to check on Dylan's well-being, but gradually their conversations had evolved into discussions about the future, both his and the valley's. "Thanks," Dylan said, accepting the steaming mug. "Just thinking about the winter feed. We lost so much in the flood. I'm not sure we have enough to get the herd through till spring." Nina leaned against the porch railing. Her leg had healed well, though she still walked with a slight limp. "The tribal council discussed something yesterday that might interest you," she said. "Since the creek changed course, there's about 40 acres of what was technically reservation land that's now on this side of the water." Dylan looked at her sharply. "And they want it back, I'm guessing?" "Actually, no," Nina replied. "Elder Joseph proposed a land exchange. That 40 acres for an equivalent portion of Double T land that's now on our side of the creek. It would straighten out the boundaries according to the new watercourse." "That makes sense," Dylan admitted, surprised. Land disputes between the ranch and the reservation had been a constant undercurrent throughout his childhood. His father had maintained the uneasy status quo, but actual compromise had seemed impossible. "There's more," Nina continued. "The council is also proposing a joint hay-growing operation on the exchanged lands. Shared labor, shared harvest. The reservation has irrigation equipment we salvaged after the flood, and you have the tractors and expertise." Dylan was silent for a long moment, watching an eagle circle lazily above the distant mountains. "Dad would have liked that idea," he finally said. "He always said fighting over land was like fighting over which part of the sky belongs to who." The next morning, Dylan drove to the tribal administrative offices to discuss the proposal. As he parked his truck, he noticed several elders gathered outside, including Joseph Skye. The old man motioned for Dylan to join them. "We were just about to visit the place where the creek changed course," Elder Joseph explained. "It would be good if you came too." They drove in 2 vehicles to the spot where Bitter Creek had violently jumped its banks during the flood. What had once been a gentle curve was now a straight channel cutting through what used to be part of the Double T's south pasture. Elder Joseph walked slowly along the new bank, his hand occasionally reaching out to touch the exposed roots of trees that now clung precariously to the edge. "The water finds its own path," he mused. "Perhaps we should learn from it." One of the other elders, a man Dylan knew only as Matthew, pointed across the creek. "That rise over there. It was where my grandfather's family camped in the summers before the reservation boundaries were drawn. There's a small spring that never goes dry, even in the worst droughts." Dylan realized he knew the spot. "We call it Cold Cup," he said. "Dad used to take me fishing there when I was little." The 2 men looked at each other, a moment of unexpected connection passing between them. Different histories, different stories, but centered on the same beloved piece of earth. As they walked the New Creek line, discussing where the adjusted boundary should run, Dylan felt something shifting inside him. The land he'd grown up believing was simply theirs had a deeper history, layered with meanings and memories he'd never considered. Later that afternoon, as the discussion moved to practical matters of irrigation schedules and hay varieties, Dylan found himself pulling out his father's old maps of the ranch. Dad kept rainfall and crop yield records going back to his grandfather's time, he explained, spreading the weathered papers on the council room table. "Might help us figure out which fields will produce best." Elder Joseph's gnarled fingers traced the faded pencil markings. "Your father was a man who understood that we borrow the land from those who come after us," he said quietly. "I see that same wisdom in you." That night, Dylan dreamed of his father, not as he'd last seen him, pale and still in death, but vital and strong, riding along a creek that flowed not as a boundary, but as a living seam binding 2 parts of a whole. Winter in Wyoming came harsh and unforgiving, blanketing the valley in snow and silence. The Double T Ranch and the reservation settled into the quiet rhythms of the season, mending equipment, tending to livestock in close quarters, and planning for spring planting. Dylan had taken to joining the twice-weekly community dinners at the reservation's cultural center. At first, his presence had raised eyebrows, but as the weeks passed, he'd become a familiar figure. He learned to enjoy the rich elk stew that Matthew's wife prepared, discovered he had a talent for the traditional stick games played after meals, and found himself genuinely interested in the stories shared by the elders around the wood stove. On one particularly bitter January evening, as Dylan helped clear dishes from the community dinner, Nina approached with unusual seriousness. "Elder Joseph would like to speak with you," she said quietly. "In private." Dylan followed her to a small office at the back of the building, where the old man sat behind a desk cluttered with papers, books, and various natural objects, eagle feathers, polished stones, and dried plants bundled with sinew. "Sit, young Thornton," Elder Joseph said, gesturing to a chair. "There is something we must discuss." The old man opened a drawer and carefully removed a small wooden box, its surface darkened with age and handling. "Last week, when the Chinook winds briefly melted the snow, some children were playing along the New Creek bank. They found something that had been exposed by the waters." He opened the box to reveal several small objects. Dylan leaned forward, curious. Inside were what appeared to be bone carvings, delicate figures of animals, some no larger than a thumbnail. "These are very old," Elder Joseph explained, his voice reverent. "They belong to a burial bundle that was uncovered by the flood. From the type of carvings and the location, our tribal archaeologist believes they may be over 200 years old." Dylan nodded, not quite understanding why he was being shown these artifacts. "What you may not know," the elder continued, "is that some of the sacred objects placed with your father at his burial were similar to these." He gestured to the bone carvings. "Not the same age, but made in the same tradition by my great-grandfather." Now Dylan understood the gravity in the room. "You want them back?" he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elder Joseph shook his head slowly. "No, what is given cannot be reclaimed. But the discovery of these ancient pieces has made me think about the circle of giving and receiving. These ancestors' remains were disturbed by the same flood that took your father. There is meaning in this." The old man carefully closed the box. "Our tradition teaches that when sacred objects reveal themselves, they do so for a purpose. I believe these have emerged now as a sign." "A sign of what?" Dylan asked. "That boundaries are more fluid than we imagine," Elder Joseph replied. "Just as the creek found a new path, perhaps our communities can do the same." 3 days later, a small group gathered at Jack Thornton's grave site. The hillside was deep in snow, and their breath fogged in the clear, cold air. Elder Joseph led a brief ceremony, speaking in Shoshone. Then, with Dylan's permission, they carefully opened the earth above Jack's burial place, just enough to place the small wooden box containing the ancient bone carvings alongside the rancher who had died saving one of their own. "Now your father guards our ancestors' sacred items," Elder Joseph explained as the earth was replaced and blessed again. "And they guard him. The circle is completed." As the small group made their way back down the hillside, Nina fell into step beside Dylan. "You understand what just happened, don't you?" she asked. "The council has never shared custody of sacred items with an outsider family before. This means the Thorntons are no longer considered separate from the tribe's spiritual protection." Dylan stopped, looking back at his father's grave. "Does that make us family?" Nina smiled, her dark eyes warm in the winter light. "It makes us something new, something that doesn't have a name yet." That evening, as Dylan sat alone in the ranch house that still echoed with his father's absence, he felt a strange peace settling over him. Outside, the wind had picked up, swirling snow against the windows like ghostly fingers. But inside, for the first time since the flood, the silence felt not empty but full of possibility, of connection, of futures yet to be written. In the valley below, Bitter Creek continued its new course, flowing beneath ice that would eventually thaw. When spring came, The waters would nourish fields worked by hands from both sides of an old divide, a boundary that, like the creek itself, had found a new and more natural path.